Good evening. I figured tonight we are going to continue with what we were looking at last week. What is Eretz Yisrael? Now we're going to talk about what does it have to do with us? What is supposed to be our relationship with Eretz Yisrael? A strictly Halakhic approach. Obviously, there's a lot of sentimentality behind Aliyah, immigrating to Israel, settling the land, Jewish pride, nationalism. All those aspects are quite important and quite motivating. And if it works, it works. But let's see how two of the major Rishonim describe which our relationship to the land should be. We're going to start with, hold on one second, we just have to share it on the screen. If you have trouble seeing it, please tell me. Okay, this is the sources we left off with last time. So the first one we get to over here is what the Rambam, Maimonides, says in the very last compendium of Halachot, in the last book, Sefer Shoftim and Hilchot Melachim, which would be laws of kings and their wars. So all the way at the end, it seems that we would have said, well, living in the land of Israel is so important, it's a basis for every other commandment. Perhaps Maimonides would have mentioned it earlier. No, he had a reason for this. It's kind of interesting. I think everybody should read the book of Shoftim, of course, and for starters, the book of Kings, because it gets into some very important ideas there about the relationship with Gentiles, basically political things involving, like I said, wars, kings and their wars. Basically, that's what politics are, or international politics, either wars or avoiding wars, or managing to have peace. And then we get into his views of the Messianic era, which is very important also. So this is, I think it's good that before we discuss the advent of the Messiah, we should also see some of these critical halachot. Here he says, Asur letzeit me'eretz Yisrael l'chutza la'aretz le'olam. It is forbidden to leave the land of Israel for other lands, l'chutza la'aretz le'olam. And le'olam means forever or in all circumstances. Chutz la'aretz obviously is going abroad. And then he gives the exceptions. Elo lilmod Torah, o lisa isha, if one needs to study Torah. This perhaps was a dispensation at the times of, let's say, the sages after the abolition of the Sanhedrin. Once upon a time, let's say in Rabbi Yochanan's time, Rabbi Yochanan still remembers Rabbi Yehuda Nasi. He's a central figure in both the Babylonian and the Palestinian Talmud, the Yerushalmi. And sometime later, the Byzantines made it very difficult for the Jews to live there. They abolished the Sanhedrin, made it very hard for Jews to practice their religion, and also made it that with the abolition of the Sanhedrin, that the Jews couldn't have the calendar the way they had it. So I can understand why then someone certainly would be among many of the Amoraim who would leave Eretz Yisrael in order to go to Bavel in order to study properly. And of course, this might have been the situation in Maimonides' own time when there was basically no real major Jewish communities, let alone yeshivot, in the land of Israel. But nowadays, I don't think this dispensation holds for anybody whatsoever. There are plenty of places where one can learn Torah here in Eretz Yisrael without having to go anywhere else. And it's also higher quality. Or to get married, that also, nowadays, I don't think anybody has a trouble finding shidduchim. If you're the type of guy you can't find a shidduch, and you think going to Chutz La'aretz will help you, then it might not be the case that it's because all the prospective matches happen to be in Chutz La'aretz. It might just be something else. But of course, this might have been a problem back in ancient times, in medieval times, etc., maybe even in early settlement times. Think about the first Moshavot. Mazkeret Patya comes to mind. Very nice book there. Check it out by Sam Finkel, Rebels in the Holy Land. Remember, the first group of men came to settle and try to keep halacha. They were a minion of men. They left their families behind. And that was usually the case during the pioneer days when it was more likely men who came to the land of Israel. So you can understand why finding a shidduch might have been harder. But today, I don't think this dispensation applies to anybody. And I guess there would be those who still disagree that perhaps that is the case. Fine, but I think we should try a little bit harder. Ola tzil miyad goyim, or to save something from the hand of the Gentiles, means major property or to save other Jews. And then he says, V'yachzor la'aretz, but he should still come back to Eretz Yisrael. That is, you have this fellow who says, well, I can't find a place to study. I need to go study at YU or in Lakewood, as it may be. He's not supposed to stay there. He's not supposed to then say, well, I needed both. So I found a good shidduch in New York, and eventually I settled in Lakewood with my wife, and everything's good. He's supposed to come back. He's not supposed to get stuck there. And he also says that a person could go, he could also go for business purposes. Usually when people go on business trips, they intend to come home. And to go to start dwelling in the land of Israel, that's forbidden. A person can't say, well, I'm living in Israel for a few years, not interesting anymore, I might as well go somewhere else. That is forbidden. Elim kain chazak sham harav ad shenasa shaweh dinar chitin b'shnei dinarim. Unless there's such a great famine that the price of wheat has basically doubled. A dinar of wheat is now costing 2 dinar. He's also going to modify this. He says, when is that? That's when people have the money, but the food is costing too much. What does that mean? Remember, back then coinage was still slightly legitimate. This is before the Romans devalued their own currency. Dinari are the currency in the Roman world. It was still based, on silver and gold, and it wasn't fiat money. So people had the money, but now there's a lot less food. Supply has gone down, which is why the price has basically doubled. Let's say the food, the produce, that's what it means, is cheap. Just doesn't have the money, or the money's worthless, or he doesn't have a job, which is usually man-made, like Dr. England has spoken about, man-made famines. People have bad monetary policy, bad economic policy. Sometimes a generation or a society gets the leaders it gets, and they choose economic policies that devalue their own currency and cause inflation and other problems so that the food is there. Or chas v'shalom, you have the situation like now, a war between two breadbasket countries up in Europe, and it's killing supply chains, and exacerbated by bad economic policy by people outside. You can understand why. For example, there's a lot of Israeli produce here that they're talking about that is not making its way to Chutz La'aretz. Perhaps it shouldn't because it's maybe Kedushat Shvit, but either way, that's how people are fed. And we get our wheat supply from Russian countries like Ukraine. So it sort of creates a problem that maybe there's food, but it's just not going around. You can't do business with it. Then he can go wherever he needs to, where he finds some profit to be made. That's a dispensation allowing one to leave Eretz Yisrael. That's a little bit redundant. Okay, dispensation or an allowance. Even though it's permissible for him to leave, midat chasidut. Still not the midat chasidut, the way of pious people. He gives the example of Machlon and Kilyon. Funny, doesn't mention their father Elimelech. Shnei gedolei hador hayu. I guess because Elimelech maybe wasn't as great as his own sons, and they left in a time of great trouble, and that is why God judged them so harshly. They all were died before coming back to the land of Israel. He says here, the great sages would kiss the edges of the land of Israel when they arrive. You've seen people come down on the tarmac. The olden days they didn't have tarmac. People would arrive by donkey, by camel, or they'd arrive by boat. They'd get down and kiss the land beneath their feet. They would kiss its stones, or they would roll around in its dust. And apparently, Maimonides is talking literally, and that's who understands what the sages were doing. They literally roll around in the dust of the land of Israel. The sages said that whoever dwells in the land of Israel, it's as though his sins are forgiven. Shneimar, uval yomar shachen chaliti, ha'am hayoshev ba nisu avon. So the prophet was saying that the people who dwell there, or shouldn't say, well, the one who dwells there shouldn't say, I've become sick. The people who dwell there are forgiven of their sins. Nisu avon means it's as though their iniquity has been removed. A person just walks 4 amot, about 6 feet, Zochel Olam Haba. He's walking just a few steps in the land of Israel. He's earned a place in the world to come. Whoever is buried in the land of Israel, also it's an atonement for him. It's as though the place where he is buried is the altar of atonement for him. As it says, this is one understanding of that expression at the end of Ha'azinu. It says that the land will atone for his people. Just by the fact that the people are literally in the ground itself, that atones for them. It also says, Ufaranut hu omer, al adamat mi'atamut. Amos, the prophet Amos, promised someone as part of his punishment he would die on contaminated land, the land of the nations. Ve'eno domeh kolato mechayim. You can't compare someone who is brought into the land accepts him while he is yet alive, to someone who has only been accepted by the land once in his passing. That is, it is very nice that those who could not be buried here, who could not live here, would end up being buried here. But it would have been better if they could live here. And he gives the examples of Yosef and Yaakov Avinu, who, when they could not return to the land of Israel, at least requested to be buried here. And like we said before, Moses himself, very interesting, he did not request to be buried in the land of Israel. He himself had been schlepping around Yosef's remains all those years. Yet when he was told he could not enter the land of Israel, and also his brother apparently, we don't find that they asked of God for the privilege to be buried in the land of Israel, which is kind of strange. And see what we've written before to try to resolve why it is that Moses, who wanted so much to be in the land of Israel, according to the sages, in order to keep the commandments, why it is that he did not at least request burial outside within the land of Israel. He continues, Lo lam yadur adam be'eretz Yisrael. A person should always want to dwell in the land of Israel. Afilu be'ir she'berubah goyim. Even a place or a city that is majority Gentile. In the olden days, unfortunately, there were no shortage of Gentile cities within the land of Israel. People know the Talmudic source for this. A person should not. It's better not to live abroad. So you see, living in Ramleh, or living in parts of Akko, or even living in some Bedouin town in the Negev, is preferable to, let's say, living in Borough Park or New Square. Anybody who leaves the land of Israel is as though someone that someone is worshiping idols. Shnemar ki gerishuni hayom mistapech benachlat Hashem lemor leich avod Elohim achirim. King David complained about Saul's persecutions and constantly chasing after him. David was a refugee, apparently for quite a few years. We'll talk, perhaps maybe we'll have a share about that, a proposed chronology for the book of Samuel. It seems that for quite a while he was being chased, and he didn't like the fact that eventually he had to even leave the borders of the land of Israel. And he said, yeah, that's like telling me go worship foreign gods. That's basically what he felt like. Ufranotu Omer, and talks about the Navi Yechezkel, when it talks about those people who are going to be forced into exile during the destruction of the first Commonwealth. Ve'el admat Yisrael lo yavau. They were promised they will not come upon the land of Israel. It's a very big problem. The person cannot be in the land of Israel. It's as though he doesn't have a relationship with God. Just like one cannot leave the land in order to live in Chutz La'aretz, so too one should not leave Bavel for other lands. As it says, Bavel yuva'u v'shama yihyu. They'll be brought to Bavel and they should stay there. That was the first exile. Now, this is kind of interesting. This is, I think, Rabbi Yehuda's opinion in Bavel was that, no, you have to stay in Bavel and not go to Eretz Yisrael. And the other Chachamim disagreed with him. You see that Rambam holds like the other Chachamim. Rambam would say, of course, a person could go to Eretz Yisrael, but he cannot choose to leave Bavel for other parts of the diaspora. There's other halachot that Rambam has, l'maaseh, the idea that he doesn't bring it here, he brings it elsewhere, about the slave, the Canaanite slave, who makes a demand of his master to make aliyah. Either we go as a family, remember, slave is sort of part of the family, or at least give me my freedom so I could go make aliyah. And it is granted to him also, or a couple, that they're getting along just fine, except one of the two want to immigrate to the land of Israel, and the one who wants to move to the land of Israel has the upper hand. Why? Because it's a commandment, it's a positive commandment to live in the land of Israel. So we have to ask this question, which is Nachmanides' follow-up question. The Rambam goes to great lengths to try to tell us what the 613 positive and negative commandments are. Goes through them. He has his own count. And it sort of is almost a failed endeavor because no one agrees on the count. Sefer Chinuch has his own count. That's the major one. There's other Sfarim. The Vilna Gaon has his own opinion trying to count the mitzvot. And of course, Ramban has written quite a nice treatise saying that he disagrees only here and there with Maimonides' own calculation, his own enumeration of these commandments. And on his glosses to Maimonides' introductory book of mitzvot, Nachmanides brings ideas, proposals for commandments that perhaps Maimonides should include it on the list. Over here, we left out the deen that the Rambam brings earlier, the Mosaic idea, like Moses told the tribes of Bnei Gad and Bnei Ruvain, technically speaking, if you're still in Chutz La'aretz, you do not have to move to Eretz Yisrael, which is kind of amazing. An individual can say, you know what, I don't want to make Aliyah, and we can't force him. As a matter of fact, an entire tribe, technically speaking, could even say such a thing. And although it is wrong, and it's not healthy for the Jewish people as a nation, unfortunately, we can't push them into it. That's something we discussed last week, that it's very hard to sell land of Israel. And like many other things in life, sometimes you need teamwork. And if you don't have someone with whom to work, then your team is going to suffer. And part of the great work that we have before us today is to convince more members of our team to come help settle the land of Israel. Nowadays, unfortunately, like we've just been mentioning, you can go to Chutz La'aretz and you could find great Jewish communities full of nice, committed and loyal Jews who, for whatever reason, are choosing to stay outside the land of Israel, even though it is perfectly within their reach to immigrate. Plane a flight is just a matter of a few hours. It's free, and hopefully, if we could get more people to move here, we'd be able also to build more towns. The Jews settle more areas. That's the ultimate goal. So Nachmanides proposes that there should be a commandment here, the commandment somehow involving the land of Israel that Maimonides left out. Hold on one second. Let's try to fix this. We're going to pause this for a second. Okay, we're back. I'm going to put the sources back on the screen for a second. Okay, very good. This is what Nachmanides writes. He says, Nitztawinu l'reshet ha'ares. We were commanded to take possession of the land. Which land? Asher Nathan ha'el yithaleh l'avoteinu l'Avram l'Yitzchak l'Yaakov. That God, His Highness, gave to our forefathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That's an interesting word, l'reshet. It's apparently the shoresh here is Yud Reish Shin. Yud Reish Shin, Lihorish, is to drive out people, or sometimes not inherit. Or sometimes it is to pass on inheritance. And that seems to be the shoresh here, not Reish Shin Hey or Reish Vav Shin. V'lo na'azva bi'ad zulatenu min ha'umot o lishmama. And we should not leave it in the hands of those who are not us, in the hands of others, other nations, or just for desolation. That is, Nachmanides says very clearly, in his days, by the way, the land of Israel was mostly desolate. He's saying it's a positive commandment that we not leave the land of Israel in that state, very clearly. And by the way, it seems that Maimonides would agree with this basic idea that this is a requirement. We are supposed to settle the land. We're supposed to take possession of it, not leave it in the hands of others, and certainly not leave it for Shmama. And the Rambam actually describes something called the Milchemet Mitzvah, earlier, he says, yeah, that's what the Jewish king is supposed to do. He's supposed to lead the conquest of the land of Israel, even if not from the Canaanites, and protect the land. And the Jews are supposed to settle there. So it almost, or we could start asking the question, why did Maimonides, if he actually agrees with this uh, basic proposal, he agrees that this is a binding tenet of the Torah, why didn't he count it as one of the big 613? We'll get back to that. V'hu amaro lahem v'roshtem et haaretz v'shavtem ba. He told them specifically v'ho rashtem et haaretz v'shavtem ba. Here he uses the hifiel, the ho rashtem. In this case, it means drive out, take possession of the land by driving out those who are already there, and settle it. Ki lachem nathati et haaretz lareshet otha. Because to you have I given this land in order to take possession of it. And another pasuk says, "With nachaltem et haaretz asher nishbati lavotechem," and you shall settle. When it hit nachil, sometimes it means to settle. Sometimes it means divide it up among yourselves. This land that I've promised your forefathers. He actually describes the entire land to the people there in the commandment, by its borders and its edges. This is right at the beginning of the book of Devarim, Deuteronomy. God basically told the people of Israel when they left Mount Sinai, now go to the mountain of the Amorites. That's a reference to the central mountain region in the land of Israel and all its neighbors. Ba'arava v'har v'ashvela v'negev v'chof hayam. In the Arava, that's in the southeast, and in the Har, that's once again the hill country. V'ashvela on the plain. The Negev, that's the southern part of Chof hayam, and the coast. The Chule, and the rest of that pasuk. Shelo yanichu mimena makom. They should not leave behind any specific part of the land that they have not conquered. And he brings over here the proof that this is a commandment, because he says with regards to those spies, he said, "Alei reish kasher diber Hashem loch." Moses tells the people that before the spies were sent out, he told them, "Go up and take possession of land as God has commanded you. Al tirav al techa, do not fear." From road that another pasuk that when they were sent to do this, when they decided not to, they had been given the chance. Katuv atamrut pi Hashem. It's as though they rebelled against God's word. The whole incident of the spies, if I could call them that, really I don't like it because it never calls them Raglim, it calls them Tarim, basically tourists. They weren't, Joshua sent spies. That was a secret mission. It seems that the 12 men sent by Moses walked in and just looked around, and they didn't do they weren't really trying to hide themselves. They were out in the open. So that's why I wouldn't call them spies. They were, just looking around, and they did just that. Either way, when the people responded the way they did, that was considered a rebellion against God's word. Why? Because God had wanted them to take over the land. And there's other proofs over here. The Nachmanides also says that a person shouldn't be confused. Here's what a person shouldn't say, highlighted in red here. Ha-mitzvah zot hi ha-mitzvah b'milchemet shiva amamin, shnesu la'abedam, shnemar acharim tachrimein. Someone could say it's just a commandment, destroy the 7 Canaanite groups, and they're not around anymore, perhaps, so this mitzvah doesn't apply. He says, no, that's not true, because we also had a commandment that, or dispensation, once again, an exception to the rule that if the Canaanites actually chose to keep the Torah as good Gentiles, then we would have no commandment to destroy them, and we could have left them as long as we take control of the place and they become second-class citizens. By the way, it's not such a bad thing. It's probably better for Canaanites or any Gentile nationality to live in a Jewish society as a so-called second-class citizen. Yes, the Jew has, I guess, more citizens' rights, but still better for them than living in some other country or some other state where there's a lot more crime and the people are not kind, bashful, and bashful, and I'm just forgetting and merciful. That's Rahman. Okay. He says here, Aretz lo naniach ota b'yadam v'lo b'yad zlota minamot b'dor min aderot. Really, it's not true. It depends on every generation. Even the Canaanites are gone. We still have this commandment all the time to take possession of the land and to settle it ourselves. Because of the time constraints, I'm not going to read the entire thing. I recommend everybody read it. He says here, Harei nitztavinu b'chivush b'chol aderot. If you look through all these psukim, and also the Sifrei brings it, and also the Rambam would agree with this, this is an eternal commandment. We are always commanded to try to take control of the land. It just makes you wonder, so what happened for, I don't know, a few thousand years? Basically, the Jews tried a few times to revolt against Imperial Rome and failed. And that just caused greater suffering. So they had to take a break for a while. And by then, there were not enough Jews in the land of Israel. And they weren't inspired enough. There was, like I said, the Jews had become scattered. It took a long time for anybody to get enough Jews together and say, you know what, we're going to try to settle land and actually create an army and defend ourselves. More on that soon. He also says, Eretz Yisrael. Also, this great commandment, the sages themselves aspire to live in the land of Israel. We said, they were kissing the stones and rolling around in their dirt. Im Kain, he says, he mitzvah aselu derot mitchayev kol echad mimenu va'afilu b'zman galut kayadua b'talmud b'mkomot harbei. He makes mention of the halachot I mentioned, or he alludes to them, that this is a commandment that applied in all generations. Everybody should go to the land of Israel, even in times of exile. Did Nachmanides himself even have a chance to do this? Yes, eventually he made his way to the land of Israel, and he was able to tell us what it was like and actually see things and explain to us, oh, Rashi may have thought this and that, but it turns out the reality is different. So we have here, like I just said, we have to get together and have an army. Is there an inherent holiness to the land of Israel? The answer is yes. For those who are part of our discussion groups, we were discussing an idea that American or Western style political theory, political science sheds a lot of light on, and that is the difference between state and government and the people themselves. The land of Israel is a physical entity. It is where we are supposed to settle. It is our homeland. We should aspire to live there, and we should control it. But who's the we? We need to do this as a group. It can't be individuals. Like the Rambam says, you need a king to do this. You need a Jewish army. Then we have the people. The people is us. The people of Israel are eternal. And like we saw 2 years ago, for example, sometimes the people don't exist completely as a people unless they're actually on the land of Israel. We saw that there's a stream in Jewish thought that says this quite clearly. Klal Yisrael is only those who are actually in Eretz Yisrael. The rest don't count. So a miracle that saves the Jewish community in the land of Israel, we say, is a miracle for all of Klal Yisrael. So that's the people of Israel. And the people of Israel become more complete when they settle the land of Israel. The state is a function of the people living on the land. The state is an institution that represents the people when they are a national entity in their national homeland. And the state has its symbols. The state represents something. The state represents the eternity of the people. The state represents shared values, shared ideals, and a shared vision and shared dreams, and also a shared history. So that is why, let's say, a state could have a head of state who is a mere figurehead. I wouldn't say a mere figurehead, perhaps. Figurehead should have certain powers, but this is a model that started in the Western world. You have a head of state, or at least someone who serves as head of state in one capacity, and then you have a head of government. And government is something that is there for technical reasons. Government is something that Judaism perhaps looks at in a skeptical manner. Like we discussed before, the idea of even appointing a king, is that in the Torah ideal? The Rav is just here about that. It's worth listening, see what the Netziv says. We saw what the Abarbanel says. We've seen some quite a lot of sources about this in previous years. And what comes out is that, or the takeaway, is that perhaps sometimes having a king isn't the best idea, or at least a hereditary king itself, once again, that great word, a mere dispensation or an allowance for a state, and by state I mean a state of affairs, not a country, a state of affairs that presents itself, and it's not an ideal. But once it happens, so we should try to have a king. Once we are supposed to have a king, we might as well have the best king we can. So government, as represented by king or malchut, whatever it may be. Like Rav Shefter says, you could have a kingdom without an actual melech. Perhaps you should have a melech. Either way, the government is only as good as the way it governs itself. That is, does it do a good job? Does it keep the Torah? And government can come and go. The state lasts forever, but governments, sometimes you need to change them. And that is why we don't attribute any inherent holiness to a government. They're merely the people who are there. And God actually has those he wants us to appoint as governors. And there are those who are disqualified. And it's our job to object and perhaps replace improper rulers, the heads of government, once we fully realize that they're not doing the right thing. And this distinction between government and state actually is kind of interesting. It comes out from none other than stories in the Book of Kings. I'll give you an example. Elijah's relationship to King Ahab and his heirs. Elijah had been given the message by God that he was to anoint a successor to Ahab in his house. Ahab's house has to be wiped out, which is not an easy or perhaps a convenient way to, or at least like I say in America, a smooth transition to a new administration. No, it's the opposite thereof. And they were supposed to anoint a new man as king, and that new man would be Jehu. Interestingly enough, Jehu, it turns out when we first meet him as a character, that is, as a person, we find that his job, he is one of Ahab's top commanders in the army, and he himself was there when he heard Elijah pronounce the horrible verdict to Ahab that God would bring about his own death, and then the death of his entire family, wipe them out and replace them. Jehu himself heard this. He was riding behind Ahab at the time, and eventually he was the one chosen by God to carry out that sentence and take Ahab's place. He eventually did to Ahab's son, by the way, Joram. Now, we see that Elijah said this, yet he still gave great respect to Ahab and his figure as the figurehead of state. He respected him greatly, ran before his chariot. Oh yeah, just before, a few days before, he had actually gotten into an insult match with Ahab. Ocher Yisrael, Anilo Ocher Yisrael, Atem Achartem et Yisrael. You were the ones who were causing so much trouble for the people of Israel, bringing this famine upon them. Same thing with Elijah's successor, Elisha, who in practice was the one who sent his own student to have Jehu anointed. He had a lot of respect. He treated the kings with respect, but he's also telling them, I disapprove of everything you are doing, and eventually I'm going to have my followers, the Jewish people, have you replaced in a bloody coup. Now, I don't think we should do that anytime soon with government. Thank God we have smoother transitions, we have elections, but we have to know that it's very important to give respect, great respect, to the Malchut and its officers. Certainly prime ministers and presidents deserve the same respect that Ahab, the same respect with which Elijah and Elisha treated even the most wicked kings like Ahab and his children. But on the other hand, we also have to acknowledge that we will do whatever we can to see that they are replaced with a proper Jewish government. That's why it's so great that there is an occasionally, here in Israel, we have elections. God knows how often nowadays we have a chance to replace the current, let's just say useless, rulers, non-figurehead. The figurehead's okay. I'd rather a figurehead not be a Levi, but be a Davidian, but what are you going to do? He has yichus. So I guess as a chudavot, his illustrious grandfather earned it for him. But the current prime minister himself is just a temporary figure. I'd rather he be replaced with someone who, let's say, his values and decisions are informed by a profound understanding of the Torah, the words of our sages, and the words of our prophets. But you see that this distinction holds up. Interestingly enough, Yehu, when he was carrying out this sentence, himself realized this. He said, the sages point out that he offered respect even to Jezebel. He had ordered her defenestration, that is, throwing her out the window, and that's what killed her. He asked who was loyal to him, carry out the sentence to Ahab's cruel, wicked, idolatrous queen. And afterwards, he tried to see to her proper burial because Bat Melechi, what are you going to do? She happens to be the daughter of a king. The king of who? Eth Baal, the king of the Sidonians, a Gentile king. But she still deserved a minimum of respect. Sages say perhaps even at that point, a little bit got into Jehu's head that he was now the king himself. So suddenly he's looking out for his own covet instead of being a humble servant of God. View that as it may, you see that this distinction holds up, and we should continue like this. I remember I was surprised, just a side point, when Obama was first elected. I heard quite a lot of Jews, because Jews tend to be more conservative leaning. Obama was, of course, a Democrat, left leaning. I heard people always saying like, "Oh, Obama must be saying terrible, really strange conspiratorial things about this." Well, very disrespectful, but I never heard it said out loud. And I listen to American news now and American commentators. People were criticizing Obama for, let's say, a policy of his, which is totally legitimate. It didn't go disrespectfully. But then when Trump was elected, I remember this 6 years ago, it suddenly changed. It was like the open disrespect and bizayon that he took from his countrymen was quite surprising. I understand why he posed, but he didn't even get to do anything yet, and people were calling almost all sorts of things that nowadays we see as falsehood. And although people were disrespectful of Obama, I remember that a little bit. Their disrespect for Trump was surprising, almost galling. Even if the man was a Russian, which he is, all these presidents are Russians, but I don't think any of them are any more moral or ethical than each other. Trump was the only difference was that he was just more open about what he does. He didn't have that filter, as they say. But either way, they treated him with a lot less respect than you would think someone who has risen to Malchus deserves. And I think that was a grave sin. But it doesn't really matter now. He's gone. Certainly, the current president doesn't exactly get so much respect either, and it's a problem. I think that here in Israel, for better or for worse, we respect our politicians, even if politicians inherently don't deserve respect. The people on top in the government deserve a certain amount of respect only because God said so. There's a bracha you say when you see a king. So even the most wicked Jewish and non-Jewish kings deserve a certain amount of respect, even if you're the prophet telling them the most horrible prophecy of their own doom. You still have to do it respectfully and treat them with respect because they are in charge, and we should keep that in mind. That is God himself. Remember, the respect that a proper monarch has, or a head of state, is a piece of the respect that we are to render to God himself. So we have to remember that. Now let's get into another point about not making aliyah. I like Dr. England, if I could quote him again tonight, hope he's listening, mentioned that when it comes to certain ideas in Judaism, perhaps the way, because things have been so long a certain way, for example, the fact that we haven't had a temple so long, we eventually, this is just an example, come up with all sorts of Talmudic sounding justifications for the status quo. And we do that, of course, after the fact justifications, but eventually we convince ourselves that these justifications and rationalizations are legitimate. And then we forget that eventually they were just that, and we have to try to go back to the sources and get back to what God really intends. And those rationalizations, justifications, those terutzim, we cannot let them get too strong. In the very first halakha in Yoredeah, that's the section of the Shulchan Aruch talking about prohibited and non-prohibited things, kashrus, nida, etc. Those are the two major topics right then. First is kashrus, so it talks about ritual slaughter. Ritual slaughter is the basis for kashrus, because even if you have a technically kosher animal, you can't eat it until you slaughter it properly. And the Shulchan Aruch, following Rambam and the Torah and Chazal, talk about who is qualified to serve as a ritual slaughterer. Not even let's serve in that capacity, but perhaps just once. Someone is not serving the community or is going to business for this. He just wants to be able to shecht, that is, slaughter his own chicken for consumption, or perhaps he wants the privilege of shechting his goat in the temple right before Passover for his Korban Pesach, which is a great thing to do. So who's qualified? And it turns out the halacha says that women are also qualified. Now, I'm going to read what the Beit Yosef says about the statement of the Torah. He says, and what the Torah wrote about women serving as slaughterers, says this is what the Tosfos say right at the beginning of Hulin. They analyze the Mishnah, its language, talking about maybe you could have thought that women are not supposed to slaughter. Maybe it's just b'diavad. It's an after-the-fact allowance. But in this case, he said, no, it's l'chadchila. It's the way it's supposed to be. He says there was the Hilchot Eretz Yisrael, which is a sefer back then. He says that women should not slaughter because I guess they're more squeamish about it, etc. Nashim da'atan kalot. Okay, we don't have any question there, and you don't want them to pass out. But he then writes, and that's why I highlighted this. The decisors across the ages have agreed with the Tosafos. Maimonides did this also. I don't think he was familiar with what the Tosafos were writing. They mention him a few places, so it's even before, Maimonides is even before them. They agreed that women, lichatchila, could serve as ritual slaughterers. But then he brings the words of the Agur, who mentions this, that there is also a practice that we see that wherever you go, women don't do ritual slaughter. I've never seen women have this practice. Women don't slaughter. And therefore, he makes a jump. He says, you shouldn't let them slaughter. This custom, apparently that women don't slaughter, overrides the halacha, the letter of the law. The practice of or the custom of our fathers is Torah. And the Beit Yosef responds that ach riyat lo ra'inu enu raya. This idea, lo ra'inu raya, means we never saw this. That's the way the Shach puts it. Lo ra'inu raya. We haven't seen this. It's a proof that maybe it's not supposed to be. And the Beit Yosef disagrees with this. You can't say just because you never saw something doesn't mean it's not supposed to be. When you open up the Shulchan Aruch, you see the Shulchan Aruch is explicit. Women could do ritual slaughter. And the Ramah holds like the Agur, saying, really, women shouldn't because of this underlying principle, as the Shach brings, lo ra'inu raya. And so let's just look at this machloket on the spot. It's kind of interesting that you see here, he says, we didn't see it happen. It must be, this is a positive act. If women don't slaughter there, it must be because women are not supposed to slaughter. Now, I don't know how many sages throughout the ages took this fallacious approach, but now let's just take it as a matter of principles and apply it elsewhere. What you can do is, why, with this principle, lo ra'inu raya, we never saw it, it must be a proof that it's not supposed to be. You could easily say, like many have at least subconsciously said, well, let's say it's 1600 or whenever it is, before the Aliyot, the modern, by modern means starting in the mid-1800s, settlement of the land of Israel. You could say the vast majority of Jewish people do not settle in the land of Israel, despite whatever we read in the Mishnah, in the Gemara, as brought by Rambam and Nachmanides, the Ramban, as we saw above. You could say that's all well and good in a Talmudic ideal, but Lamaisa, practically speaking, the Jewish people do not live in the land of Israel. The Jewish people do not settle the land of Israel. The Jewish people do not have a state or an army. And by the way, is the army holy? The army is there in order to do a job, just like any other government ministry. Government is supposed to do things, and government is not inherently holy. There are some people who consider the Misrad HaChinuch, the Ministry of Education, holy of holies because it's a arm of the government of Israel. And I say to them, the Ministry of Education is the sages. And if you are openly at odds with their teachings, then we don't care what you have to say, and you're not holy. And Ministry of Health, that's a kind of, I guess, an oxymoron, because really health is the the domain of the individual and his physician who knows him the best. It is not saying that government should get involved in government, obviously, and politics getting involved in the sciences. Uh, what can this be compared to? The sciences maybe used to have objective bodies that uh, knew about psychological evaluation, but then they started changing their definitions of psychological problems, mental illnesses, in order to fit their political biases and agendas. So too, they used government health ministries, or their, let's say, the American equivalent, they call Ministry of Health, as CDCs, NHS, and all those other things. They put people who are obviously not healthy. Here in Israel, like we said before, the minister of health is someone who openly engages and advocates obviously unhealthy, historically unhealthy practices. In America, they have people who just deny basic human biology, and they're dictating for us what to do. That's not holy. That's just foolishness and politicization. So too, the army is there to be led by a proper Jewish king for the defense of the people of Israel and the land of Israel and controlling the land of Israel. And the second army does things against the Torah, uses its power against its own citizens, trying to settle the land of Israel. Imagine that the army is supposed to be composed of Jews, driving out hostile Gentiles, making the land under Jewish control, allowing Jews to settle. And instead, the army becomes hostile to Jewish people who are trying to drive out their enemies and settle the land of Israel. That's not holy. That's just messed up. And you need a new commander. And you have to change things. So you could have said that, well, the minhag, all these years, we tried to do it, we got it wrong. The government that sometimes does terrible things or destroys part of the land of Israel, commands an army that destroys part of the land of Israel and works against its own citizens. We could have said, you know what, we shouldn't have had such a thing. We should not have a Jewish army because we haven't had one so long, and that proves that we shouldn't have it. No, that's not the case. That's not Halakhic. That's not a Halakhic consideration. Lo ra'inu eino raya. Or one could say, it's been so long since the Jewish people had a temple or even visited the Temple Mount. Don't forget, for hundreds of years, in practice, even if it was the Gentiles who imposed this on them, for hundreds of years, the practice was that Jews do not visit the site of the temple. They don't go there to pray. They don't aspire in practice to rebuild the temple in any meaningful way. Perhaps it means that we should not do so. It's not what God wants from us currently. And the minhag, like he says here, ha-minhag mevatel halacha, the halacha is build a temple. The minhag that we try not to perhaps overrides this. And we have to say very clearly that we hold like the Shulchan Aruch, lo ra'inu eino raya, just because we have not seen Jews try to perform these basic commandments, even for millennia, it does not mean that we should not try to do so. It just means that God is waiting for us, and He's Erech Apayim. He is very patient with us, and is withholding retribution because we have continued to sin and we've been foolish, and sometimes we just have lost the way. We have been blinded by so many years of being in the exile. And that brings us back to the first thing we said. Rambam says you shouldn't live in Chutz La'aretz. You live in Chutz La'aretz, you are going to have these distorted ideas. Yes, they sound halachic, but you are going to take yourself away from keeping the commandments. Avera goreret avera, or bitul mitzvah, gorer levitul mitzvah. One sin leads to another. Ignoring one commandment will bring you to ignore another commandment. If you ignore living in the land of Israel, you'll forget eventually anything related to Tuma and Tara. You'll forget about Kodashim, everything related to the temple. You'll forget how to speak the language of the Torah. You will eventually not. What mitzvah do they not keep in Chutz La'aretz? They stop putting tcheles in their tzitzis because they're away from the place where the tcheles comes from. In Europe, they even stop, the Kohanim stop blessing people every day, even though it's explicit they should keep a commandment to do that. How many commandments have we forgotten to do because we're stuck in the land of the Gentiles? Nothing bad against them, by the way. They should, those who are watching, you should know we appreciate you, your support, and we want to help you also keep God's will and keep His word. But the problem is Jews don't belong there, and eventually they might even come to be convinced of all sorts of utter nonsense. The falsehood of that's nowadays the major falsehoods that we discussed in the previous weeks. Those are there to tell us it's just like in the olden days. Remember, the biggest falsehood you could get by going to Chutz La'aretz is worship of non-gods, all the idols, the false gods. That is what you get when you live in Chutz La'aretz. And when you live in Eretz Yisrael, it's as though you're worshiping God properly. Why? You could say, well, I live in Muncie. Everybody's Jewish. I live right in the middle of Kew Gardens Hills. Everybody's Jewish. There's synagogues everywhere. You don't understand. The very land itself is contaminated, and you are, just by mere osmosis, you're just picking up, just by being there, breathing the very air. You are contaminating your minds and bring yourselves away from being able to keep the Torah as it is meant to be kept. And hopefully these two great Rishonim, Nachmanides and Maimonides, who tried their hardest to get to the land of Israel and get to the temple, and who wrote these commandments to us, perhaps their teachings will rub off on us. So to answer the first question, so why didn't Maimonides count this as a commandment? It's a technical answer. You read right before he counts the mitzvot, he says all sorts of rules for why I count this and why I don't count that, why I count this as 2, why as 1, how he does it. Very complicated rules that there's been a lot of ink has been spilled, a lot of discussion. Does Maimonides even stick to these rules? It seems that he agrees with Nachmanides' fundamental assertions of the halachot involved with settling the land. But it's not one of the 613 because it itself is a prerequisite for keeping all these other commandments. Having a king and fighting the wars, keeping the land, the mitzvot tatzliot ba'aretz, and therefore it's just not one on the list. But it doesn't mean it's any less of an obligation upon us. God willing, we should all live to see the final stage of the ingathering of the exiles. And I don't think there's any question. I don't think we have time for questions anyways. Just so you know. Okay, that wasn't a question someone sent. So God willing, if you have future questions, just send them to me. And we'll see you next week. Don't forget, like, share, subscribe. And if you have requests for other topics, now we'll do so. Next week, we'll get into a different topic. We'll talk about Talit and how often one should be doing so, what the sages thought about that, what it has to do with the onset of the Sabbath. And we hope that we'll see you then also. Be well and have a good night.
We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. We would also like to suggest the following opportunity to our viewers. If you identify with Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to sponsor or dedicate a video interview with the rabbi in honor or memory of a loved one, if you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org. If you are inspired by Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to get involved in Torah Eretz Yisrael activities in your local area, please fill out the relevant form by going to the link which appears on the screen.